Welcome to Real Talk, the show where we're giving real answers to real worship leaders who are asking real questions. If you want your question to be on a future episode, go ahead and head over to leadingworshipwell.com/realtalk, fill out the questionnaire form there, and I will get your question, and it might show up on a future episode. Since this is the first episode, I'm going to be answering some questions from the Worship Leaders Plus community over on Facebook. I'll link that, and Worship Leaders Community, what's it called? Wilco, whatever, WLCO. I'll link both of those down in the description below so you can join those Facebook groups. But let's get into the real talk. First question is this, and I'll keep these anonymous since these people are from a Facebook group, and they didn't specifically ask me the question. It says, hello, my pastor and I are working through a list of guidelines for our worship team. He's wanting to include membership of the church as a prerequisite. The more I think and pray, the less I want this in there. Thoughts, please. Pros and cons. So your pastor wants people on the worship team to be a part of the church. Church membership, I guess, is what it says specifically. What are the pros and cons to that? Well, I think that there are only pros to that. I've talked about this before, especially in relation to unbelievers. I'll link another video that I did about should you let unbelievers on your worship team, but my thought process is kind of the same. When I'm looking for worship team members, I want, number one, believers on my worship team, because my worship team isn't just a group of musicians playing music. I believe that everybody on the worship team is a worship leader. We are putting people on stage in front of our church. When we do that, they take a leadership role, even if they're just in the background playing bass. And so, number one, we need to make sure that they're believers, because we wouldn't have somebody who's just good at speaking show up to our church and speak on Sunday. Why would we have somebody who's just good at playing music come and lead worship on Sunday? It's the same thing. So they need to be a believer, or else they can't fulfill the responsibility that they actually have of leading worship. Now, let's get a little bit more granular about it, because you're specifically asking about membership of the church. So let's assume that somebody is a believer, but they do not currently attend your church. In that case, my requirements for my team is still that you've been coming to my church for at least 6 months. I'd say like 3 to 6 months, depending on how well I know you. But I don't just have random people from other churches or maybe unchurched believers join my worship team, because I want people who understand the culture and the vision that my church has. They are a part of the body. So first of all, just from a culture perspective, like every church has a culture. Every church has a way that we do things, whether we express those values every week like some churches do, and we've got them plastered in our church lobby, or they're just unspoken rules of how we do things. First of all, you should make those unspoken rules spoken, but we need to make sure that these people coming in understand the culture of the church, or else they're going to be doing something completely opposite maybe of how our church functions. And so it just leads to a smoother transition onto the worship team if they already understand the culture of your church. So that's number one. But also number two, the best way to lead people in worship is to actually know the people that you're leading. That is how you lead people in worship. So just for you as a worship leader, if you're struggling leading worship, maybe you can get to know the people in your church, but it also extends to your worship team. If this person's just some random Christian coming in off the street, that doesn't mean that they're a horrible person. I'm just saying that they don't know the people of your church, and so they probably won't be able to lead them very well. So we want to make sure that the people on stage are people that our church members have seen before, because they'll know them and they'll trust them, and they will allow them to lead them in worship. So to answer the question, your pastor's wanting to include church membership in the prerequisites for joining the team. What are the pros and cons? There are only pros to that. Only allow people who are in your church, who've been coming for at least 3 to 6 months, who are believers, to be on your worship team. On to the next question. I need some help. Our lead pastor doesn't want teenagers on my main team. I disagree, but that's okay. The problem is we have some very gifted youth. Now, I know what most of you would think. Okay, so just use them in youth worship. Problem is we don't have a youth worship team, and it's not our youth pastor's vision to have one anyway, or the culture of our youth right now. I'm already stretched thin as it is. Join the club. And there is no one to build it in my place anyway. But that leaves nowhere for these youth to be used in their gifts or to be discipled. That feels gross to me. What should I do? Any ideas other than just wait to utilize them when they're adults? So I guess there's two questions here, maybe even three. The first question that I hear is, should we allow youth on our worship team? And just picking up from that last question that I answered, I don't think that I set an age limit on the requirements to be on the worship team. Obviously, I don't think I want like a third grader who just picked up guitar leading worship on Sunday. But my requirements are, if you are a believer and if you've been coming to church for 6 months, then you can join my worship team. I think my age limit would probably be like high school. Like I would let high school kids join my worship team. I don't know if I have a strong argument behind that, but I would definitely allow youth, quote unquote, to be on my worship team. So from that perspective, yeah, I'm kind of in agreement that this person is like, I don't see why younger people can't be on the worship team as long as they're a believer. So maybe you just need to talk through that with your pastor and be like, hear what their thoughts are. Like, if this person is a believer, can God not use young people just as he can use you or I? I understand that they might not be as mature as a believer just because they're younger, but they can still be a believer at the age of 16, so God could use them. So I would let a youth member on my worship team. So that's the first question. The second question that I hear, which wasn't specifically asked in this post, was, what do I do when my pastor says to do something and I don't agree with it? And I think at the end of the day, unless something is completely unbiblical, then we submit to our pastor's leadership, because our pastor is the one who is ultimately responsible for the church. So if that is a decision that they aren't willing to budge on, then I think it's our job as other leaders in the church to submit to our pastor's vision, as long as it's not unbiblical. So is this unbiblical? I wouldn't say that it's necessarily unbiblical. I just disagree with it, and I'm sure that your pastor has reasons behind why they're doing it. They don't just hate the youth in your church. So understand, this is something I think about all the time, like leaders in the church who are maybe higher up on the organizational scale than you, they have a bigger picture of what's going on in the church than you do at your current position. This is like, I liken it to when a church member comes up and gives me a song suggestion. They're just like, I like this song and I want to sing it. But they don't understand that when I pick out songs for the entire set list or my entire repertoire, like I'm thinking through multiple facets of things. Like I'm making sure that we're hitting on specific theological points. I'm making sure that we have a good balance of songs about us responding to God, theologically rich songs that teach us doctrine, those sorts of things. And they're just like, I like this song. So they don't have the full picture of the worship ministry. Likewise, when our pastors make a decision like that, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes they have a bigger picture than what we have. And so we have to submit to that. Part 3 of the question, how do we get these kids involved? Well, number one, I don't see why you wouldn't have a youth team. If you have the capacity to do it, why wouldn't you raise that up? And maybe that looks like having your youth come to your normal worship rehearsal. Like maybe you don't specifically have a youth rehearsal, but you have these kids come and just join you for rehearsal. And then maybe other leaders in your church will see that there is interest there. I also hear that this person's burnout. Like you're burnt out and you've got a lot going on already, so you can't do it. And so I hear that. We have to balance those things in ministry. You can't do everything in ministry. I think any good leader has more ideas than they have the capacity to fulfill. So that's actually a sign of good leadership, when you aren't just content with where you're at and you're like, man, I wish I could do this, 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 and this. At the same time, as leaders, good leaders, decide what is important and focus on those things. So decide what's important. Maybe you feel burnout, but there are, 4 other things that you're doing that you don't really need to be doing, and maybe this is more important. So you get rid of those 4 other things and focus on leading the youth worship team. Where could you get them involved? Maybe they're allowed to lead, quote unquote, on a Wednesday night gathering at your church. Maybe you could get this team ready and then show your youth pastor that these kids can lead, so they can lead a couple songs during their youth group time. I mean, those seem like the most obvious places. I don't know where else they would lead in your church other than a Sunday morning or at youth group. I mean, I don't think that that's that weird to have a youth group band lead worship at youth group. That seems perfectly reasonable to me. So maybe your youth pastor just doesn't see the vision for that yet. Or a lot of times leaders in ministry think if somebody's asking about something, then they just want me to do it. So if you take the initiative and build the worship team, then your worship pastor will understand that this is just a tool that they have in their ministry that they can use, and they didn't have to develop it or anything. So those are my thoughts on youth in worship. This question comes from, and I just remembered it, it's the Worship Leader Collective. All I know is it is Wilco, because they always talk about Wilco. Question is this: does anyone ever struggle to actually worship when leading a team/leading worship? When I'm leading a worship night, for example, all I ever desire is to be like the people standing in the back and worshiping freely. Yet, because of all the logistics, being a key instrument, having to lead both vocally and musically, etc., it's really hard for me to worship in that freedom. Of course, I can just do this at home alone, but I'm just really longing to worship in community without the burden, quote unquote, of leadership. Unfortunately, I'm in a situation most times, even in an unplugged kind of setting, I'm always the one who has to take the lead because of the fact that I play guitar and sing, limited in lead instruments. Am I alone on this? Any tips? Raise your hand in the comments below if you can relate to that. How many of us have felt before? I know I've felt it before, where it's like, I have a lot of responsibilities when I lead worship. And if you're doing it right, you do have a lot of responsibilities whenever you're leading worship, because what I'm hearing in this question is actually a good thing, because it tells me that this person is not, you are not letting your personal worship usurp your corporate worship time. And that's what we need to understand, is that when we gather together, we are supposed to be worshiping with the other people. You function as leader of that time. And so it's not that you aren't worshiping whenever you are leading worship. It's that you have a different role in the gathering. But guess what? Everybody has a role in the gathering. Nobody is supposed to be just standing there having a personal time of worship with God. We are supposed to be encouraging the people around us. And so when I hear people talk about how I can't worship when I lead worship, we need to understand that leading worship is worship. We need to understand that our obedience and our leadership in the church is worship. It is bringing glory to God. And worship is not, I have this feeling, and I feel the presence of God, me, one-on-one with Him, this vertical connection. That is not what worship is. That is sometimes a result of worship, but that's not what we're chasing. We are chasing giving glory and praise to God, and in His abundant grace, He reveals Himself to us. But that's not what we're chasing after. So we need to start seeing our worship leading as worship. Like this person said in their post, like you said in your post, you can worship at home alone. That is what that time is meant to be. When we gather with the church, we are gathered together. And I would argue that you, as the worship leader, are probably experiencing more what corporate worship is supposed to be than the other people in your church, because a lot of people come into corporate worship with that consumer mindset where it's just like, what can I get out of this today? But that's not how we're supposed to worship when we're together. And so you, as somebody who's thinking about other people, thinking about the responsibility that you have to the other people in your church, that's what corporate worship is. So you aren't missing out. It just looks differently, and we've all been taught for our entire lives that we are supposed to have this personal connection with God on Sunday morning and forget everybody else around us, when that's not how it works. So understand that your worship leading is worship. Now, if you understand that worship leading is worship, but you want to get out of that mindset of like focusing on all the logistics. I've got a free training for you. It's called 5 Tips to Instantly Improve Your Worship Leading. These are 5 simple things that you can do that will instantly improve your worship leading. Check it out down in the description below. They aren't hard to do, but whenever you know them and make the consistent effort to do them, I think that it will free you up to quote unquote worship in the way that you want. If you just focus on these 5 things, it'll open you up on Sunday to stop thinking about all the logistical things and be able to lead an engaging time of worship with confidence. So check out 5 Tips to Instantly Improve Your Worship Leading down in the description below. Also, if you have a real question and you are a real worship leader and you want a real answer to your question, head over to leadingworshipwell.com/realtalk and submit your own question there, and you might be on a future episode. Until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.